The rain over Chicago's south side wasn't just weather, it was a physical weight, a cold, suffocating blanket of misery that pressed down on the city, amplifying its sorrows. It hammered the asphalt of the alley off 79th Street, slicking the grime on the brick walls until they gleamed like weeping sores under the strobing red and blue lights of a squad car. The air, thick with the smell of wet garbage and urban decay, tasted metallic on the tongue. It was a Tuesday night in late October, a night for staying inside, a night for ghosts. Officers Miller and Russo, their faces pale and youthful under their uniform caps, treated the scene with the bored impatience of men who believed they were above it. They saw the crumpled figure on the ground, not as a man, but as paperwork, a problem to be logged and passed on. "Jesus, what a mess," Miller grumbled, his voice a flat Midwestern drone that cut through the rhythm of the rain. Another banger gets his clock cleaned. Probably the GDs and the BDs doing what they do best. "Call the meat wagon, Russo. I want to get a hot coffee before the shift ends." Russo, barely out of the academy, nodded eagerly. "You got it. Think we need to tape this whole disaster zone off?" "For this?" Miller scoffed, gesturing at the bleeding man with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Nah, let the detectives deal with it. It's just another piece of street trash taking itself out." The words, spoken with such casual cruelty, hung in the frigid air. They embodied a sickening polarization, the brutal, intimate violence that had torn one man's body apart, set against the cold, bureaucratic apathy of the system meant to serve him. This wasn't just a crime, it was a quiet, ongoing statement about whose lives mattered in this city. The man on the ground, whose name was Andre Johnson, though they didn't know or care, wasn't dead yet. A low, wet gurgle, a sound thick with blood and shattered hope, rattled in his chest. His suit, a finely tailored pinstripe that spoke of boardrooms and downtown expense accounts, was now a ruined canvas painted with the grim palette of his own suffering. That's when the headlights of an unmarked sedan cut through the gloom at the alley's entrance. The car parked, and Detective Marcus Mark Holloway emerged. He moved with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who had seen too much to ever hurry again. At 52, Holloway's face was a roadmap of long nights and lost causes, but his eyes, deep-set and weary, still held a sharp, assessing fire. He was a black detective who had survived 3 decades in the crucible of the CPD, a constant balancing act between the blue wall of silence and the black community he came from, trusted by neither and burdened by both. His gaze swept the scene, taking in the details the patrol cops had ignored, the careless positioning of their vehicle, the lack of a secured perimeter, their detached posture. He felt a familiar, acidic burn in his stomach. It was the taste of disrespect. "What's the story, Miller?" Holloway's voice was a low baritone rumble, a sound that carried its own authority. Miller stiffened, his casual demeanor evaporating. "Detective, got a John Doe here. Looks like a gang-related beatdown. Pretty bad. We were just about to call it in." "You were about to leave him," Holloway corrected, his voice dropping a notch, becoming harder. "I want this entire alley taped off, from the street to the back wall, now, and get me a log of every car that's passed here in the last hour from traffic cam footage." He didn't wait for a reply, already pulling on a pair of latex gloves. He knelt in the filthy, swirling water, the cold seeping through the fabric of his slacks, his focus entirely on the man who was still fighting for his life. He saw the defensive wounds on the man's hands, the expensive watch shattered on his wrist. This wasn't a gangbanger. This was money. This was different. "Sir, can you hear me?" Holloway leaned in close, his voice a calm anchor in the man's sea of pain. "My name is Detective Holloway. Help is on the way. Just hold on for me." Andre Johnson's one functioning eye, a slit of terrified white in a mask of swollen purple flesh, struggled to focus on Holloway's face. He saw not a uniform, but a man. A black man kneeling in the filth to help him. A desperate, primal need to communicate surged through him. A final act of will against the encroaching darkness. His lips, split and bloody, moved, forming words that were more air than sound. Holloway pressed his ear closer, the stench of blood and fear filling his senses. The whisper was a fragile thread of sound, almost stolen by the wind and the rain. It wasn't a name, it wasn't a description. It was a title, a royal decree delivered from the very gates of hell. The king, Sends his regards. The trauma bay at University of Chicago Medical Center was an orchestra of controlled chaos. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, the hiss of the ventilator, the clipped, urgent tones of doctors and nurses. It was the sound of a life hanging by a thread. Andre Johnson was alive, but only just. He was a prisoner in his own body, his jaw wired shut, his world reduced to the sterile white ceiling above him and the pain that was a constant screaming fire. Detective Holloway sat by the bed, a silent sentinel in the storm. The hospital's sterile environment was a world away from the alley's filth, but it felt just as grim. It was a place of stark contrasts, the miraculous life-saving technology that surrounded Andre versus the primitive, savage brutality that had put him there. This was the new face of crime, a collision of worlds that left Holloway feeling like a relic. "Andre," Holloway said, his voice soft, not wanting to agitate the man. "I need your help. The men who did this, they're still out there. The king. You have to tell me what it means." A nurse had provided a small whiteboard and a marker. With a trembling, agonizingly slow hand, Andre scrawled a single, shaky letter. K. K, Holloway repeated, leaning in. Is that the first letter of a name? A place? Andre shook his head, a gesture that sent a visible wave of pain through him. He wiped the board and began to write again, each letter a monumental effort. APP incognito. Her name on the AP. Holloway felt a cold stone of frustration settle in his stomach. He'd spent his career chasing ghosts in the physical world, shadowy figures in dive bars, informants in darkened parking lots. Now he was chasing a ghost in the grid. Andre, through a series of pained scribbles and gestures, painted a picture of a digital underworld Holloway had only read about in tech journals. Incognito wasn't just an escort service. It was a fortress. Military-grade encryption, Andre wrote. Decentralized servers in non-extradition countries. Biometric login. All messages self-destruct 60 seconds after being read. He looked at Holloway, his eyes wide with the memory of its seamless, terrifying anonymity. You don't exist. She doesn't exist. Only the transaction. Back at the 2nd District Precinct, Holloway felt the chasm between his world and this new one. He slammed his fist on his desk, the frustration boiling over. "They're making it impossible," he growled to his partner, a young, tech-savvy detective named Chen. "We've got a Vic who can ID his attackers, but the witness who links them all together is a damn ghost protected by a digital Fort Knox." The tech unit confirmed his fears. "It's a black box, Mark," the unit supervisor told him over the phone. "Trying to hack this thing is like trying to punch a cloud. We can't touch it." Holloway leaned back in his worn office chair, the springs groaning in protest. He stared at the name he'd scrawled on his own whiteboard, Jamal King Davis. The name resonated with the dark history of the South Side. Jamal wasn't just a gang leader, he was an icon, a charismatic and ruthless visionary who had turned the 79th Street Kings into a disciplined, corporate-style enterprise before an armed robbery charge had landed him in Cook County Jail. A man like that didn't lose his power when they locked the door. He just changed his address. His influence was a cancer that had metastasized, reaching far beyond the prison walls. Hours bled into one another. Holloway drowned himself in data, visitor logs, recorded phone calls, commissary reports for Jamal Davis. It was a digital haystack, and he didn't even know what his needle looked like. He was looking for a whisper, a tell, a single mistake. Then, deep into the night, as the city outside finally quieted, he found it. It wasn't in the calls or the visitors. It was in the money. A small but regular monthly transfer from Jamal's commissary account to the account of another inmate, a small-time hacker named Gizmo doing a 2-year stint for phishing scams. It was a retainer. Jamal was keeping a tech guy on his payroll inside the walls. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot he had. He made a call to the prison warden he knew from a past case. "I need you to toss a cell, quietly. I need inmate Gizmo's contraband phone, and I need it yesterday." The wait was agonizing. Holloway paced his small office, the city lights twinkling below like a fallen constellation. Finally, at 3 a.m., his phone buzzed. It was Chen from the tech lab. His voice was electric. "Mark, you glorious old-school bastard, you were right. Gizmo had a burner, and he's not just a fisher, the guy's a genius. He built a mirror script that scrapes metadata fragments from a dozen of these shadow apps before they're fully encrypted and routed offshore. It's a mess of data, but I cross-referenced the geotags. The K profile. She uses a scrambler, but the initial handshake ping to the server always originates from the same Wi-Fi network, a residential building on the west side, every single time. Holloway felt a surge of adrenaline that wiped away his exhaustion. He typed the address into the county database, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He pulled up the tenant records, and there it was. The name on the lease. The name of the woman paying rent with cash deposits every month. Keisha Davis. Jamal's wife. The ghost in the grid wasn't a ghost at all. She was flesh and blood. And Holloway knew, with a certainty that felt like ice in his veins, that he was no longer just investigating an assault. He was standing on the edge of the king's private bloody war. The aroma of burnt coffee and cinnamon filled the air at the Daily Grind, a small, unassuming cafe on a corner of the west side that felt a million miles from the violence of the south side and the cold power of downtown. It was neutral territory, a place of transient anonymity where Holloway hoped Keisha Davis might feel safe enough to lower her guard, if only for a moment. He sat in a worn vinyl booth, the morning sun casting long shadows across the floor, and watched the door. When she entered, she was a study in self-effacement. Dressed in a shapeless gray hoodie and faded jeans, she seemed to be actively trying to disappear. Her shoulders were hunched, her head down, her eyes scanning the room from under the shadow of her hood. She wasn't the hardened consort of a gang kingpin. She looked like a scared kid carrying the weight of the world. She clutched the strap of her worn leather purse as if it were a shield, her knuckles white. Holloway raised a hand, a small, non-threatening gesture. Her eyes, large and dark and full of a profound weariness, locked onto his. For a second, he saw raw panic, the instinct to turn and flee. But she held her ground, took a deep breath, and walked toward his table with the leaden steps of someone heading to their own execution. The polarization was heartbreaking. This woman, who moved with such fear and fragility, was at the center of a storm of incredible violence. She was both the reason for the war and its most vulnerable target. Detective Holloway? Her voice was a soft, hesitant whisper. Mrs. Davis, thank you for meeting me, he said, gesturing to the seat opposite him. Can I get you some coffee? She shook her head, sliding into the booth but sitting on the very edge, poised to run. I don't understand what this is about. Your message, it was very vague. It's about your husband, Keisha, Holloway began, deciding that a direct approach was the only way. And it's about a man named Andre Johnson, who is currently in the ICU fighting for his life. Before he was beaten into a coma, he told me your husband sent his regards. A mask of practiced denial fell over her face. I don't know who that is, and Jamal is in prison. He can't. I know about Kay, Holloway said, cutting through the lie gently but firmly. I know about the incognito app. I know Andre was your client. The fight visibly drained from her, leaving behind a raw, trembling vulnerability. Her shoulders slumped, and she sagged back into the booth as if her bones had turned to dust. She closed her eyes, a single tear escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. It's not against the law, she whispered, the words a flimsy defense against the ruin of her life. Assaulting your clients is, Holloway countered. And I don't believe for a second you arranged that, Keisha. But he did. And you and I both know it. The question is how. How did the king find out his queen had a secret life? The dam broke. The story spilled out of her in a broken, desperate flood. It was a textbook tragedy of the American inner city. Jamal's decade-long sentence. The predatory lawyers demanding a fortune for an appeal that was a statistical long shot. And then, the ultimate blow? Her mother in rural Alabama wasting away from pancreatic cancer. The experimental treatment that was her only hope, costing more than Keisha could make in 5 years of honest work. I worked 3 jobs, detective, she sobbed, her voice thick with shame and grief. I was never home. I never slept, and I was still sinking. A friend, she told me about the app. She said it was for rich men, lonely men. She said it was safe, anonymous, no one would ever know. Her voice cracked on the last word. I told Jamal I got a job as a cocktail waitress at a hotel bar downtown. He hates that I have to work, but he seemed to believe me. He's so smart, so perceptive. I don't know how he could have found out. Prison walls have ears, Keisha, Holloway said grimly. And a man like Jamal has more ears than most. Has anything else happened? Anything strange? Have you felt like you're being watched? She hesitated, her gaze darting to the window, her paranoia a living thing in the space between them. She chewed on her bottom lip, debating whether to trust him with this final terrifying piece. About a week ago, she said, her voice dropping so low he had to lean in to hear her. I came out to my car. It's an old Honda, nothing special, but it's mine. All 4 tires were slashed, not just punctured, slashed to ribbons, like someone took a butcher knife to them. Holloway felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Was there a note? She nodded, a slow, terrified motion. Her hand went to her purse, her fingers trembling as she unzipped it. She pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, now creased and worn from being looked at 100 times. She pushed it across the table. Holloway unfolded it. There were no threats, no demands. Just 2 words, written in a thick, angry black marker. The letters pressed so hard they had almost torn through the paper. I know. If Keisha was the epicenter of the earthquake, Holloway knew her best friend, Simone C.C. Jones, was the fault line. He needed to understand the tectonics of their friendship, to grasp the full picture. He met C.C. at her apartment, a vibrant, chaotic sanctuary of bright colors, bold art, and the defiant scent of sage. The place was a reflection of its owner, unapologetically alive. Cece herself was a whirlwind of energy, her cascade of purple braids swaying as she moved, her eyes sharp and missing nothing. So, you're the cop who's got my girl spooked, Cece said, her tone a mix of challenge and concern. She didn't offer a handshake, just gestured towards a plush velvet couch. Let's get one thing straight, detective. You want to know if I knew what she was doing? Hell yes, I knew. I'm the one who gave her the login to the damn app in the first place. There was no shame in her admission, only a fierce, protective fire. This was the friendship's core polarization, a bond of intense ride-or-die loyalty, forged in the face of a world that offered them nothing but danger and disappointment. Cece wasn't just a friend. She was a co-conspirator in Keisha's survival. You don't have a problem with it? Holloway asked, his pen poised over his notebook. Cece let out a sharp, humorless laugh. A problem with it? Detective, having a problem is a privilege for people who have choices. Keisha's choices ran out the second they slammed that cell door on Jamal, and the second the doctor gave her mama a death sentence. You think she enjoys this? You think she likes selling pieces of her soul to lonely old white men in hotel rooms? No. She's doing what she has to do to keep the people she loves alive. I'd do the same damn thing for her. The loyalty was absolute, but Holloway sensed a complexity beneath it. She still loves him, he stated, watching Cece's face for a reaction. After everything, she's still trying to get him out. Cece's hard expression softened, just for a moment, revealing a deep well of sorrow. That's the tragedy of it all, isn't it? She loves that man with every broken piece of her heart. And to be fair, before he went away, he loved her too, in his own way. She got up and began to pace, her energy too restless for the small room. He put her on a pedestal, detective, treated her like a goddess, his queen. He would have killed for her. And he almost did, Holloway prompted. Cece stopped and turned, her eyes dark with memory. You heard about that? Yeah, some poor bastard at a bar made the mistake of trying to buy her a drink. Just a friendly gesture. Keisha handled it, turned him down with a smile, but Jamal saw it. He didn't yell, didn't make a scene. He just walked over, cool as can be, and dismantled the guy. Broke his jaw, his orbital bone, a couple of ribs, put him in the hospital for a week. Jamal's love isn't the gentle kind. It's a cage, a beautiful gilded cage, but a cage all the same, and he is the only one allowed to have the key. The story painted a chilling portrait of a man whose love and violence were 2 sides of the same coin. She thinks he's found out, Holloway said. If he has, it had to be someone from the inside, someone close, Cece mused, her brow furrowed in thought. Someone who knew them both back in the day. Does he have anyone on the outside he trusts? Someone who could be his eyes and ears? Holloway pressed, sensing an opening. Cece hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. She picked at a loose thread on her sweater, a small, nervous gesture that betrayed her tough exterior. "Detective, if Keisha gets hurt—" "That's what I'm trying to prevent," Holloway said, his voice firm but reassuring. "I need to know who he might turn to." She let out a long, heavy sigh, the sound of a woman surrendering a dangerous secret. There was one guy, Dante. They called him the Shadow. He wasn't muscle like the others. He was quiet, observant, smart as a whip. Jamal trusted him implicitly. When Jamal got sent up, Dante was supposed to watch over his queen, make sure she was safe and provided for. "So, where is this Dante now?" Holloway asked, a new name to add to his board. Cece shook her head, a look of genuine confusion on her face. "That's the mystery. About a year ago, he just disappeared, vanished. His phone was disconnected. He left his apartment, everything. No one from the old crew has seen him. It's like he dropped off the face of the earth." She met Holloway's gaze, her own eyes filled with a dawning fear. But if Jamal could get a message to someone on the outside, if he needed a ghost to do his dirty work, Dante would be the one. And God help anyone who got in his way. The mini hook wasn't a clue, but the absence of one. A loyal shadow who had vanished into thin air. A ghost who might have just been resurrected. The air inside Cook County Jail was a physical entity, stale, recycled, and heavy with the combined scent of industrial disinfectant, cheap food, and the low-grade despair of 6,000 men. For Holloway, walking these corridors was a journey into a parallel universe, a concrete kingdom with its own brutal hierarchies and unwritten laws. He was here for an audience with its incarcerated monarch. The interrogation room was a claustrophobic cube of cinder block and steel. When they brought Jamal King Davis in, he didn't shuffle like a prisoner. He strode like a man entering his boardroom. He wore the standard-issue gray jumpsuit, but on his frame, it looked less like a uniform of subjugation and more like a minimalist statement of power. He was tall and composed, his cuffed hands resting lightly on the metal table. But the real source of his power was his gaze, calm, intelligent, and deeply unsettling. It seemed to strip away all pretense. The polarization in the room was palpable, the absolute physical confinement of his situation versus the boundless, commanding aura of his presence. He was a lion in a cage, and he was still the king of the jungle. "Detective Holloway," Jamal said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that seemed at odds with his surroundings. "An unexpected pleasure. I trust my wife is all right?" The opening gambit was perfect, the concerned husband. It was a move designed to put Holloway on the defensive. "Your wife is the reason I'm here, Mr. Davis," Holloway said, forgoing the pleasantries. He sat opposite him, the small table a no man's land between them. "I'm investigating a violent assault on one of her associates." Jamal arched an eyebrow, a picture of mild curiosity. "Associates? My wife works at a cocktail lounge. I'm afraid I'm not familiar with her colleagues." "I'm not talking about her colleagues. I'm talking about her clients," Holloway said, watching for a reaction. "From her other job, the one she does through the Incognito app." There it was. Not a flinch, not a gasp, but a subtle, chilling shift. The air grew colder. The friendly curiosity in Jamal's eyes was replaced by something ancient and hard, like obsidian. The king had just been told someone had touched his property. "I don't know what you're talking about, detective," he said, his voice losing its warmth, becoming flat and metallic. "My wife is a respectable woman. She is holding my family together while the state unjustly keeps me in this cage. It sounds like someone is feeding you poison to slander my name." "A man named Andre Johnson was beaten nearly to death," Holloway pushed on, laying out his cards. "The men who did it gave him a message to pass on to me. They said, 'The king sends his regards.'" Jamal leaned forward, the intensity of his presence seeming to suck the air out of the room. He didn't raise his voice, but it took on a menacing softness. "My name is a flag, detective. A lot of fools wave it to feel important. That has nothing to do with me, and it certainly has nothing to do with my wife." He spat the word out, as if it were a foul taste in his mouth. "My queen, who I trust, implicitly." The lie was so bald, so perfectly delivered, it was almost convincing. but Holloway saw the white-knuckle grip of his cuffed hands on the table, the muscle that jumped in his clenched jaw. This was a performance, and the actor was furious at having his script challenged. "When did you last see her?" Holloway asked, shifting tactics. "2 weeks ago, our monthly visit," Jamal said, the concerned husband persona returning. "She's tired, working too hard for me, but she's strong. She's a fighter." "Does anyone else write to you, besides Keisha and your lawyer?" Holloway knew the answer. He'd seen the mail logs. There were 2 other letters from an unknown sender in the past month. Jamal's eyes narrowed slightly. "No, no one." Another lie, delivered without hesitation. Holloway knew he would get nothing more. He stood up, the metal legs of his chair scraping against the concrete floor. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Davis." As he reached the door, Jamal's voice, now stripped of all pretense, stopped him cold. "Detective?" Holloway turned to face him. The mask was completely gone. Jamal's eyes were blazing with a cold, controlled rage that was more terrifying than any shouting. "You're a brother," he said, the word a complex mix of solidarity and threat. "You know how this world is stacked against us. You know that a black man's name, his family, his legacy, is all he has. It's all they can't take." He paused, his gaze boring into Holloway. "I hear Roseland is a nice area, safe, a good place to raise a family." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. It was a promise. The king, from his throne in a concrete cell, had just reminded Holloway that his reach was long, and that this was no longer just about Keisha. He had put Holloway's own family on the board. The small, unassuming cardboard box appeared on Keisha's doorstep, like a harbinger of doom. It had no postage, no return address, meaning it had been placed there by hand. Someone had stood right outside her door. The thought made her skin crawl. With a trembling that started in her hands and spread through her entire body, she carried it inside and placed it on her small kitchen table, staring at it as if it were a bomb. The act of opening it felt like a violation. Inside, the contents were arranged with a kind of cold, malicious artistry. On top, a stack of glossy photographs, each one a perfectly framed tableau of her secret life. There she was, smiling at a silver-haired man in the lobby of the Four Seasons. There she was, getting into a gleaming black Cadillac, with another man she barely remembered. Each photo was a dagger, professionally taken, clinically presented, stripping away her anonymity and exposing her shame. Beneath the photos, a single black USB drive. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. With a sense of dread so profound it felt like drowning, she plugged it into her old laptop. An audio file. She clicked it. The sound of her own voice, warm, laughing, and intimately conversational, filled the silence of her apartment. It was her K voice, the persona she adopted, talking with Andre Johnson about wine and travel. Heard now, it sounded hollow and fraudulent, the ghost of a woman she pretended to be. At the very bottom of the box was a folded piece of paper. The words were laser-printed, impersonal, and utterly terrifying. "The King's Queen has been a very busy girl. $5,000. Small, unmarked bills. Leave it in a bag in the trash can. On the southeast corner of Garfield and State by Friday at midnight. If you're late, or if you even think about calling the cops, this entire package, plus video, gets overnighted to the warden at Cook County Jail. The king deserves to know who his queen really is." A violent wave of nausea seized her, and she barely made it to the bathroom before she was sick. She knelt on the cold tile, her body racked with gut-wrenching sobs of pure terror. This wasn't just extortion. This was psychological warfare. It was designed to isolate her, to terrorize her, to make her feel completely and utterly alone. As she stumbled back into the living room, her eyes fell on one last object in the box, nestled in a corner, almost hidden. It was small, brassy, and glinted evilly under the dim light. A single, spent 9mm shell casing. The sight of it stole the breath from her lungs. This was street semiotics she understood perfectly. It wasn't a random threat. It was a specific coded message. It was the signature of Jamal's old life, a life of brutal, unforgiving violence. The escalation was dizzying, a descent into a nightmare. The polarization was absolute. The clean digital crime she committed for survival versus this dirty, physical, terrifyingly real threat that now sat on her kitchen table. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers barely able to dial Holloway's number. Her voice was a frantic, broken whisper when he answered. He was there in 20 minutes, his calm, imposing presence a small island of stability in her churning sea of panic. He methodically examined the contents of the box, his face a grim mask of concentration. He picked up the shell casing with a pair of sterile tweezers from his kit, holding it up to the light. He turned it over and over, his brow furrowed. "Keisha," he said, his voice low and serious. "The 79th Street Kings, did Jamal ever talk about their rituals? Any special marks they used?" "No," she choked out. "He kept that world completely separate from me. He said he wanted to protect me from it." "A little late for that," Holloway muttered grimly. He pulled out his phone, activated the magnifying feature on his camera, and zoomed in on the base of the shell casing. His breath hissed out between his teeth. "Damn it!" He turned the phone so she could see the screen. There, etched into the soft metal of the primer, was a tiny, intricate symbol, barely visible to the naked eye. It was a small, three-pointed crown, and running through the middle of it was a single, deliberate scratch mark. "It's a vanity mark," Holloway explained, his voice tight with a new urgency. "A signature, the crown for the kings, and the scratch. That was the mark of Jamal's most trusted lieutenant. A kill confirmed, a job done right. It was a sign of respect, a mark of honor within the crew." He looked up from the phone, his eyes meeting hers, and she saw a deep, cold anger in them. "Whoever is doing this to you, Keisha, isn't some amateur who got lucky. This isn't just about money. This is personal. This is someone from Jamal's inner circle, someone who wants to watch you both burn." The unique signature on the shell casing was a key, unlocking a very specific door in Holloway's investigation. It transformed the vast, anonymous city of Chicago into a small, claustrophobic room with only a handful of occupants. Most of Jamal's old inner circle were either dead or serving life sentences in supermax prisons, but the database spat out one name that was still in the wild: Terrence Wright, a.k.a. T-Bone. A former lieutenant, a man known for his cunning rather than his brawn, who had been paroled from Stateville Penitentiary 6 months prior. Holloway found him holed up in a dilapidated tenement in Inglewood, a building that seemed to sag under the weight of its own neglect. The air in the hallway was thick with the smells of poverty, fried food, stale cigarette smoke, and a damp, mildewy despair. The man who answered Holloway's knock was a shrunken, haunted version of the confident gangster in his mugshot. T-Bone was thin and wired, his eyes constantly darting, his skin slick with a nervous sweat. "Police," Holloway stated, holding up his badge. "I need a word with you, Mr. Wright, about an old friend, Jamal Davis." The effect was instantaneous and profound. T-Bone physically flinched, stumbling back a step as if Holloway had thrown a punch. A terrified squeak escaped his lips. "I don't know nothin'," he stammered, his voice high and reedy. "I'm out of the life, man, for real. I'm on parole. I walk the straight and narrow. I ain't seen or heard from nobody. I'm clean." The denial was too fast, too total. The polarization of the scene was stark. T-Bone's frantic, all-consuming fear versus Holloway's cold, gathering suspicion. This wasn't an innocent man startled by a cop at his door. This was a guilty man terrified of being exposed. "I never said you weren't clean," Holloway said, his voice deceptively mild as he stepped, uninvited, into the cramped, squalid apartment. The room was a mess of takeout containers and dirty clothes. "Just a few questions about the old days." The ensuing conversation was an exercise in futility. T-Bone was a wall of terrified denial. He hadn't spoken to Jamal. He hadn't heard from any of the old crew. He barely knew who Keisha was. He lied poorly, his eyes refusing to meet Holloway's, his hands fluttering at his sides like agitated birds. Holloway decided to apply pressure. "Someone's been terrorizing Keisha Davis," he said, his tone hardening, "sending her photos of her private life, demanding money she doesn't have. They're trying to destroy her." He let the silence hang in the air for a moment before delivering the finishing blow. "And they sent her a little message, a spent 9mm shell, with a crown and a scratch mark on the bottom." The last vestiges of color drained from T-Bone's face, leaving it a sickly, grayish pallor. "Never seen it," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Don't know nothing about that. That life is over for me." Holloway saw the lie in his panicked eyes. He knew, with gut-level certainty, that T-Bone was his man, but certainty wasn't evidence. He needed something more. He decided to poke at the man's pride, the last refuge of a fallen soldier. "You and Jamal were tight back in the day," Holloway mused, looking around the pathetic apartment. He was the king, had it all, the power, the fear, the respect, and he still does, even from inside. Still has his beautiful queen waiting for him, loyal as ever. He paused, letting the words sink in. "Must be hard to watch from the sidelines, huh? Seeing him still have everything while you've got this." It was a direct hit, a flash of pure, unadulterated hatred, dark and ugly, twisted T-Bone's features. It was the ancient resentment of the second-in-command for the king. "I'm doing just fine," he spat, a ghost of his old swagger returning. "I'm free. He's the one living in a cage, ain't he?" "Is he?" Holloway countered softly. "Or maybe you're the one in the cage, T-Bone. A cage made of jealousy." The conversation was over. T-Bone had clammed up completely. Frustrated, Holloway turned to leave. As he did, T-Bone made a feeble attempt at normalcy, reaching for a glass of water on a cluttered end table. You want some water or something?" His hand was shaking so violently that water sloshed over the rim of the glass and onto his wrist. As he reflexively jerked his hand back, the frayed cuff of his sweatshirt rode up his forearm for a fraction of a second. But a fraction of a second was all Holloway needed. There, on the inside of T-Bone's forearm, was a fresh, angry-looking scar. It was a perfect circle, the skin pink and puckered. It was a burn, the distinct, unmistakable brand of a car's cigarette lighter, having been pressed into the flesh. It was a mark of pain, of panic, of a story far more complex than the one T-Bone was telling. It was a piece that didn't fit, a flaw in the liar's armor, and Holloway knew it was the key. Detective Holloway walked away from T-Bone's apartment building with the bitter taste of frustration in his mouth. His instincts, honed by 30 years of chasing liars, were screaming that Terrence Wright was the blackmailer, the fear, the simmering resentment, the burn mark. It all painted a picture of a guilty man. But instincts weren't admissible in court. T-Bone had been careful. The extortion package was a ghost, scrubbed of the prints and DNA. Holloway knew, with a sinking feeling, that the burner phone and laptop used in the crime were likely at the bottom of the Chicago River by now. He was at a dead end, with a man's life hanging in the balance in a hospital bed and a woman's life spiraling into terror. There was one last, unconventional play. It was a Hail Mary, a tactic that often drew smirks from old-school cops, but Holloway was out of options. He called the K-9 unit and requested their most specialized asset. The following afternoon, Holloway stood at the edge of a sprawling, derelict lot behind T-Bone's tenement. The area was an urban boneyard, a graveyard for forgotten things, mountains of rotting tires, skeletal remains of furniture, and the rusting carcasses of abandoned cars. It was here he met Officer Kelly, a sharp, no-nonsense woman, and her partner, Shadow. Shadow was a magnificent German shepherd, not a patrol dog trained for aggression, but a highly specialized electronics detection dog, EDD. His nose was a finely tuned instrument, trained to detect the specific chemical signatures of lithium-ion batteries, circuit boards, and memory cards. "You really think our guy was dumb enough to ditch the hardware in his own backyard?" Kelly asked, her skepticism evident as she fitted Shadow with his search harness. "He's not dumb, he's arrogant and scared," Holloway countered, his eyes scanning the daunting landscape of urban decay. "He thinks he's smarter than us. He'd want to get rid of it, but he'd want to know it's gone. He'd dump it somewhere close." The scene was a study in contrasts, a perfect polarization for this strange case. A crime born of high-tech anonymity being hunted by the most ancient tool in law enforcement. The primal, superior sense of smell of a dog. For hours they worked. The task seemed impossible. Shadow moved with a methodical, focused grace, weaving a grid pattern through the acres of debris. The wind carried 1,000 distracting scents. Holloway's initial hope began to curdle into frustration. They found half a dozen discarded cell phones from the early 2000s and the circuit board of an old television, each find a small, deflating disappointment. Kelly was about to call it. "Mark, maybe he just chucked it in a dumpster. We could be here all week." Just as the words left her mouth, Shadow, who had been investigating a pile of rain-soaked mattresses, froze mid-stride. His entire body went rigid, his head cocked, his tail straight as a rod. A low whine rumbled in his chest. Then he let out a single, sharp, explosive bark and bolted toward a mountain of rotting wooden pallets and discarded construction materials. He began to dig furiously, his powerful paws sending dirt, rust, and God knows what flying. "He's on it!" Kelly yelled, her voice electric with excitement. Adrenaline surged through Holloway. He and Kelly scrambled over the debris, pulling away splintered wood and twisted rebar. Beneath the pile, the earth was soft and recently disturbed. Shadow was now in a frenzy, his barking echoing through the desolate lot. His claws struck something hard with a dull, metallic thud. Holloway reached into the shallow hole and pulled it out. It wasn't a laptop. It was a small, fireproof metal lockbox, caked in mud. It was heavy, sealed tight. Using the claw end of a hammer from his trunk, Holloway pried the lid open. The contents sent a jolt through him. There, nestled in plastic bags, were the burner phone and the small laptop. T-Bone hadn't destroyed them. He'd hidden them. The arrogance Holloway had suspected. But that wasn't the real discovery. Beneath the electronics lay a thick, black, spiral-bound notebook. A diary. With gloved hands, Holloway opened it. Page after page was filled with a cramped, spidery, furious script. It was a testament to a diseased soul. It was a detailed chronicle of T-Bone's festering, obsessive jealousy of Jamal Davis. He wrote about feeling disrespected, cast aside, forgotten. He detailed his meticulous plan to not just extort Keisha, but to systematically destroy Jamal from the inside out. He wanted to poison Jamal's mind, to take the one thing the king valued more than power or respect, the unwavering loyalty of his queen. The diary was a blueprint for psychological torture, detailing every photo he took, every conversation he recorded. But as Holloway flipped toward the end, his blood ran cold. The last few entries detailed the letters he'd already sent to Jamal in prison, letters full of twisted truths and outright lies, all designed to inflame Jamal's possessive rage. The final entry, written just the night before, was the mini hook, the final horrifying twist of the knife. She called her friend. She's pregnant. It's too perfect. The ultimate weapon. The final letter goes out tomorrow. I'll tell him it's not his. I'll tell him his queen is having another man's baby while he rots in his cell. That will do it. That will finally shatter the king. This was no longer a case of extortion. Holloway was holding a signed confession to a meticulously planned murder by proxy, and the final act was already in motion. The confirmation of her pregnancy, delivered by a kind-faced doctor at a free clinic, should have been a moment of joy, a ray of light in her suffocating darkness. For Keisha, it became something else entirely, a desperate last-chance gambit. It was the only truth powerful enough, she believed, to counteract the lies that were poisoning her life. When she called Holloway, her voice was no longer the broken whisper of a victim. It was infused with a new, terrifying resolve. "I'm going to see him, detective," she announced, her tone leaving no room for argument. "My visit is scheduled for Wednesday. I have to tell him everything, face to face, about the work, the blackmail, and about our baby. It's the only way he'll believe me. If he looks me in the eye, he'll know. Keisha, that is the single most dangerous thing you could possibly do," Holloway argued, his voice raw with urgency. The words from T-Bone's diary were seared into his brain. That will finally shatter the king. He's not the man you remember. He's been systematically poisoned by T-Bone's letters. You won't be walking into a conversation. You'll be walking into an execution. "And what's the alternative?" she cried, her voice cracking with a mix of defiance and despair. "Let him believe the lies? Let this thing destroy us completely? No. My husband, the man I love, is still in there somewhere. I know he is. Our love is stronger than this hate. I have to believe that." Holloway heard the tragic, unshakable faith in her words. It was the blind love that builds legends and fills graveyards. The polarization was absolute. Keisha's desperate, irrational hope versus Holloway's cold, evidence-based certainty of the danger. He knew arguing was pointless. If he forbade it, she would find a way to go anyway, without any protection. "All right," he finally conceded, his voice heavy with a sense of impending doom. "We do it. But we do it my way. I'm calling the warden. I want you in the high-security family visiting room. I want 2 guards stationed directly outside the door, not 1. And I will be in the monitor room next door, watching every single second. The instant he raises his voice, the instant he even looks at you wrong, I'm hitting the panic button, and my people are flooding that room. Do you understand?" "Thank you, detective," she whispered, relief and fear warring in her voice. The day of the visit arrived under a bruised gray sky that promised a cold, unforgiving rain. Holloway met a pale but resolute Keisha at the prison gates. She wore a simple blue dress, a color meant to signify peace and trust. Her hands rested almost constantly on her still flat abdomen, a protective, maternal gesture. As the guards led her through the first set of steel doors for processing, Holloway's phone vibrated with an incoming call. It was an unknown number. He almost ignored it, but a nagging instinct made him answer. "Detective Holloway?" a woman's voice said, hesitant and shaky. "You don't know me. My name is Maria. I was Terrence Wright's neighbor." "Was?" Holloway asked, his focus sharpening. "He's gone. He packed a bag and left in the middle of the night. But he was acting strange all week. He had a visitor, a woman. She was here a lot. I saw her through my peephole. Fancy clothes, nice car. They were always arguing. Last night, I saw her slip an envelope of cash under his door." "Can you describe her?" Holloway asked, a cold dread coiling in his stomach. "Yeah, she was black, tall, very stylish, had these bright purple braids, all the way down her back. The world seemed to lurch and tilt on its axis. Cece Simone Jones. Keisha's best friend, her protector, her ride or die. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Cece gave her the app. Cece knew every secret, and Cece was paying off the blackmailer. But why? Just then, his other line buzzed. It was the forensics lab. "Mark, we got a rush on the prints from that diary," the tech said, his voice grim. "We matched the second set. It's not a hit from the criminal database. It's from the DMV. The prints belong to a Simone Jones." Betrayal. It was a conspiracy. A tangled, venomous web spun by 2 people Keisha trusted. Holloway looked up, his eyes wild, at the security monitor. He saw the heavy steel door of the visiting room click shut. Keisha was inside. The trap, so carefully and cruelly set, had just been sprung, and he was on the wrong side of the door. The high-security visiting room was a sterile, soundproofed box designed to contain the most volatile emotions. Painted a sickly, calming green, it was furnished with nothing but a heavy polymer table and 2 chairs, all bolted to the floor. There were no partitions, no glass, offering the illusion of intimacy. But in the corner, the dark hemispherical eye of a CCTV camera served as a constant, silent reminder that this was not a place of trust. It was a cage within a cage. Holloway, watching from the cramped monitoring room next door, felt a suffocating sense of helplessness. On the screen, Keisha sat waiting, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. She looked small and fragile in the stark, unforgiving space. The door buzzed open, and 2 guards escorted Jamal in. The change in him was terrifying. The charismatic king, the master manipulator, was gone. In his place was a hollowed-out automaton. His eyes, usually so alive with intelligence and cunning, were flat and dead, like dusty windows on an abandoned house. He moved with a stiff, robotic gait, his face an expressionless mask. The letters, filled with T-Bone's poison and Cece's treachery, had done their work. They hadn't just angered him. They had broken something fundamental inside him. Keisha stood as he entered, a tentative, hopeful smile touching her lips. "Jamal," she breathed, her voice filled with a desperate love. He didn't respond. He didn't meet her gaze. He simply sat in the chair opposite her, a statue carved from rage and grief. "Baby, talk to me," she pleaded, reaching across the table to touch his hand. He didn't pull away, but his hand remained cold and inert beneath hers, a piece of stone. The confession poured out of her then, a frantic, tearful torrent. She told him everything, the crushing weight of the bills, her mother's sickness, the soul-crushing desperation that led her to the app. "It was never about them, Jamal," she sobbed, her words tumbling over one another. "It was always about us, to keep us afloat, to get you home. It meant nothing. You are the only one. You have to know that. Holloway watched, his hand hovering over the red panic button on the console. The guards in the room with him were tense, their eyes glued to the screen. The silence from Jamal was more menacing than any threat. It was the calm of a deep, dark ocean before a tsunami. He was letting her talk, letting her empty her soul, all while his own was collapsing inward into a black hole of betrayal. "And there's more," Keisha said, her voice dropping, her hands moving to rest protectively over her stomach. A genuine radiant hope flickered in her tear-filled eyes. "Jamal, I'm pregnant. We're having a baby. Our baby." For one infinitesimal second, a crack appeared in Jamal's stone facade. A flicker of raw human agony, the ghost of the man he once was, seeing the one dream he held on to, being offered to him now, in what he believed was a package of lies. The polarization was absolute and devastating. Keisha's offering of a pure, life-affirming truth, crashing against the fortress of lies that had already conquered Jamal's mind. The dream had become the final, unforgivable insult. His dead eyes slowly lifted to meet hers. When he spoke, his voice was a flat, dead whisper, a sound from the grave. "Is it mine?" The question, devoid of anger or jealousy, was a blade of ice to Keisha's heart. "Yes," she cried, her voice breaking. "Oh God, Jamal, of course it's yours. How could you even think that?" "Because my queen would not lay with dogs," he whispered, reciting the poisonous script T-Bone had written for him. "My queen would not carry another man's heir to my throne while I rot in this place. You are not my queen. You are a whore." "No, that's a lie. Someone is doing this to us," she screamed, half rising from her chair. Holloway didn't wait. He slammed his fist down on the panic button. "Go! Go now!" he roared at the guards. But technology has a lag. The electronic lock on the door took 2 seconds to disengage. It was 2 seconds too long. Jamal moved with a liquid speed that was terrifying to behold. It wasn't the clumsy rage of a street brawler. It was the efficient, practiced violence of a predator. His right hand shot out from under the table. Clutched in his fist was a 6-inch sliver of sharpened white plastic, honed to a razor's edge on the concrete floor of his cell. The handle of a toothbrush, transformed into a deadly stiletto. A shiv. He didn't lunge. He flowed across the table, a current of pure destructive intent. He grabbed Keisha's hair with his left hand, yanking her head to the side, exposing the soft, vulnerable column of her neck. He didn't hesitate. He drove the shiv into the carotid artery, just below her ear, with a single, precise, and utterly final motion. He twisted it, severing everything. The guards burst through the door as Keisha's eyes went wide with a look of shocking, profound incomprehension. She didn't scream. A single choked gurgle escaped her lips as the guards tackled Jamal, wrestling the shiv from his hand and slamming him to the floor. She slumped forward, a marionette with its strings cut, her head hitting the table with a soft thud. A torrent of crimson blood pumped from the wound, a gruesome flower blooming on the pale green landscape of the room. Holloway was the first one to her side, shoving past the chaos. He saw the last light of recognition fade from her eyes, her final look not one of fear, but of utter heartbreaking confusion. She had died without ever understanding why. As the guards hauled a limp, unresisting Jamal from the room, a sound began to emanate from him. It started as a low chuckle in the back of his throat. Then it grew, swelling in volume and pitch, until it erupted into a full-throated, howling laugh of pure, shattered madness. It was the sound of a king celebrating the destruction of his own kingdom, a terrifying, insane fanfare that echoed down the long, cold corridor, a final, brutal testament to a love that had turned to ash. The aftermath of the massacre was a quiet, bureaucratic flurry that did little to mask the profound sense of failure hanging over the precinct. Reports were filed, statements were taken, and the slow, grinding gears of the justice system began to turn. Jamal Davis, now housed in the supermax wing of the prison, had retreated into a catatonic silence. He ate, he slept, he stared at the wall, a living monument to his own ruin. He was a king who had abdicated his soul. The final, pathetic act of the tragedy played out in a sterile interrogation room where Holloway sat opposite Simone C.C. Jones. The vibrant, fierce woman he had met was gone, replaced by a gray, trembling ghost. The purple braids were disheveled, her face streaked with tears, her eyes hollowed out by a grief so profound it was almost a physical deformity. The loyalty that had once seemed so noble was now exposed as a cancerous, all-consuming obsession. The confession came not in a flood, but in a series of broken, whispered sentences, each one an admission of a staggering moral failure. "I loved him," she began, her voice a raw, shredded whisper. "Before her, he was my world. He saw me, really saw me. And then she came along, all soft and sweet, and he tossed me aside, like I was nothing. Yesterday's news." Her path had crossed with a bitter, newly paroled Terrence Wright at a support group for former inmates' families. She saw in his festering jealousy a reflection of her own wounded pride. Together, they concocted their toxic plan. T-Bone, driven by envy, wanted to see the king fall. Cece, in her delusional heart, believed that if she could just shatter Jamal's perfect image of Keisha, he would see his mistake. He would see that Cece was the strong one, the loyal one. When he was finally free, he would come back to her. "It was just supposed to break them up," she sobbed, her body racked with convulsions of guilt. "I paid T-Bone to push it, to make it ugly, so Jamal would leave her. I never, ever thought he would hurt her. I loved Keisha. She was my sister. I just wanted him back. I just wanted him to see me again." But he hadn't seen her. He had seen nothing but the red haze of betrayal they had so carefully painted for him. Both Simone and Terrence Wright were arrested, their initial charges of conspiracy and extortion elevated to first-degree murder under the state's felony murder doctrine. Their plot had directly and foreseeably led to a death. They had built the bomb, and Jamal had been the detonator. A month later, a cool autumn wind rustled the leaves in a quiet cemetery on the city's far south side. Holloway stood before a modest granite headstone, the grass still fresh and unsettled. The inscription was simple: Keisha Davis, beloved daughter, and baby Davis. He stood there for a long time, the silence of the place a stark contrast to the noise and violence of the case. He thought about the terrible, perfect storm, a corrupt and indifferent system that created desperation, a man's pride so brittle it could only be expressed through possession and violence, a woman's love so blind it led her into the heart of the inferno, and the petty jealousies of two broken people who decided that if they couldn't have a piece of that love, they would burn it all to the ground. As he finally turned to leave, the setting sun casting his long shadow across the graves, the central, unavoidable lesson of the tragedy settled upon him with a familiar, weary weight. It was a truth he had learned over 30 years of wading through the wreckage of human lives. In a world of systemic pressure and personal demons, love is never enough. It doesn't conquer all. More often than not, it's just the most precious, fragile thing to be broken. It can be a shelter, but it can also be a cage. And sometimes the most dangerous thing a person can be is the sole possession of a king who would rather rule over a kingdom of ash than risk losing his crown.